Okay. So this is the last one, not here, but this one. And this is all the appendicular skeleton. So maybe I'll just introduce it and call it a day. There are two things. The first things that are important are the attachments. So we call them girdles. The pectoral girdle is a two-bone assembly. This is the attachment between the upper extremity and effectively your torso. It's attached in one place. You have your collarbone, the clavicle, and it's attached to the scapula. They form a two-bone unit called the pectoral girdle, one on each side. This is it. Okay? This would be, for instance, it's attached in one place here. That bump that you can feel, you move your upper extremity, your fingers on that, you can feel that part moving around. That's the sole attachment of your upper extremity to your axial skeleton. Even though this has got screws on it, the only attachment is right there. It's called the clavicular sternal articulation. It's very important, and it's designed for one thing: mobility, flexibility. It moves a lot. Whereas you have a much broader attachment. Remember when I showed you this? You've got a lot of bone-to-bone contact on each side between the sacrum and the hips. That does not have anywhere near the mobility, but it's got a ton of stubble. And that's universal in the body. When you're like me, when you're in medicine, I did a lot of bone and joint work. It's either mobility or stability. That's the way things are designed. It's very rare that you find something that has a lot of movement and flexibility that's terribly stable, and the other way around. Something stable is very secure, but doesn't move a whole lot. So the pectoral girdle is a two-bone assembly. Effectively, your shoulder is both, but your arm going into your shoulder is here, not one spot. But your hip is that big head going into that big socket. And as we go into it, you'll see why it's so stable. So you have the pectoral girdle, which is this two-bone assembly, and the pelvic girdle, which is the hip bones as they attach to the sacrum. So the shoulder or pectoral girdle, clavicles and scapula, again, like this. Great degree of mobility. The scapula aren't attached at all to the skeleton. They're just form basically the socket and supporting structures for the arm. And the socket is flat. It's got a little bit of socket shape. The analogy, and it's a great one in the textbook, it's like a golf ball sitting on a tee. I mean, you have probably 80 to 90% not in the socket. Whereas in the hip, more than half of it is in the socket. So just anatomically, just physically, the difference. Here's what it looks like. The one point of attachment, the sternoclavicular joint. This is very famously called the acromioclavicular joint. The anatomy of the scapula is such that the shelf that's above the socket is called the acromion or acromion process. This is called the coracoid process. They're important. A lot of stuff attaches to it. But the clavicle or collarbone is the most frequently fractured bone in the body, more than a finger or a toe. This is the bone that breaks the most. And when it doesn't break, and you've seen it in sport all the time, someone's falling and they put their arm down to brace themselves and they get up doing this. They're holding their shoulder, they're going to hold their arm like this. They've either dislocated their shoulder, fractured their clavicle, or perhaps even more commonly had what's called a shoulder separation. This joint is relatively flat. It's two bones that are held with a very, very small amount of surface area that kind of go back and forth. So when you hear about a separated shoulder, this is where they separate. When you hear about a dislocated shoulder, it's down here in this big socket. And again, it's a relatively flat socket that we'll learn in joints has a relatively large lip. So clavicles are collarbones. They have a wide end that goes toward the sternum and the acromion end, which is flat. That's all you have to know. So all I need you to know is the difference between a clavicle and a rib. Well, the clavicle is quite thick, has a very unique wide end and flat end. The ribs are just sort of half moon or quarter moon shaped and relatively flat. The scapula, very interesting in the sense that it has a very, if you look at it from the back, it has a very distinctive shelf in the back. We call it the shoulder blade. It's also known as the spine of the scapula. If you look at it this way, it has above the spine, it has an indentation or a hollow. Below the spine, it has a hollow. And because it sits this way, sort of angled upward, if you will, it has a hollow area underneath it. So these are fossa. Above the spine, supraspinous. Below the spine, infraspinous. And below the body of the scapula, subscapular. They're important because three muscles that make up something called the rotator cuff, three of the four muscles for the rotator cuff come from here. So you'll see it. So it has a lot. And you'll see it in a second. The spine, the acromion process, the coracoid process. There's a little notch that you can see over here. Not a big deal. But this is really the telling part. So here's the little notch that's there. But you can see the acromion process, the cavity, which is called the glenoid, that's what's the bony part of the socket. And then the coracoid process, very important for stability. What stabilizes your arm and your shoulder is not bone to bone. It's mostly muscles and tendons and ligaments holding it together. That's why it moves so well. Quite different in the hip. In the back, we have the spine, supraspinous and infraspinous fossa here, underneath it anteriorly. And so you can see them even better here. Here's the glenoid, and it has a rim around it made of cartilage called the labrum. Here you have the acromion, supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa, and the subscapular fossa. So it's very distinctive. And then other than that, and I think we'll start here because I don't really have a lot of time to finish all of that. The arm, the forearm, and the hand. The relationship is very interesting because you have one bone in the arm, the humerus, two bones, radius and ulna, and then you have the wrist bones, in this case 8, and then 5 metacarpals and 14 phalanges. In the lower extremity, you have one bone in the thigh, upper leg, if you want to call it that, the femur. You have the tibia and fibula in the leg, 2 bones, just like the radius and the ulna, very similarly arranged. Not 8 bones in the wrist, but 7 bones in the ankle and rear part of the foot. 5 metatarsals and 14 phalanges making up the toes. So it's very similar. The hand and the foot are similar by their components. One less tarsal bone, same metatarsals, same phalanges, same arrangement, different sizes, of course. Radius and ulna, we have tibia and fibula. Arm, you have humerus. Lower extremity, you have femur. Femur is the longest and strongest in the lower and in the whole body. The humerus in the upper extremity is the longest and the strongest. And there's a lot of anatomy. That's why I don't want to start it now with all this. So let's call it a day, and maybe I'll send you some additional stuff dictating-wise. And then we'll meet back and probably do lower extremity and joints, and then we'll all able to individually look at the bones next time. All right? And I'll make sure I don't have to redictate this other stuff that's here. So thank you.